Welcome to Om Times TV, a division of Om Times Media and Broadcasting. Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Dov Baron has dedicated his life to codifying how we apply meaning to any given situation through authenticity and leadership. The founder and CEO of Dov Baron International, he's been named a top 30 global leadership guru 5 times, and he's the best-selling author of the books The Red Thread and Fiercely Loyal: How High-Performing Companies Develop and Retain Top Talent. Dov's focus on human behavior and neuroscience has made him the world's leading authority on emotional source code and the anatomy of meaning. Dov Baron joins us now to share the 10 books that inspired his life the most. Dov, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you so much. I really am excited to be with you. I love our conversations.
So you said that making this list, distilling all your books down to just 10, was dramatic.
It was torture, not dramatic. It was torture. It's like being asked your 10 favorite songs. I felt like I was on desert island discs with books.
Yes, it is quite a task, isn't it? So what criteria did you use? I mean, how did you manage it?
I think that more than anything, what I used was this desire to look at the impact more than anything. I wanted to know what had really impacted me. How was it impacting me? And did it still impact me? That was kind of my way of saying, all right, that's what I got to go to. That was that's how I got to it.
Well, the first book on your list is one of my favorites, and it's your Bible, you say, and it is The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, published in 1923. What do you love about that?
Well, as I said, it's my Bible because I think that whatever is going on in my life, I can look to that and find an answer, find an insight that is profoundly grounded emotionally, but at the same time deeply spiritual. I haven't really got a lot of patience for spiritual woo that is like, well, just think the right thoughts. No, like this is like, what does it mean? Like when he talks about work, when he talks about friendship, when he talks about these things in a way that makes me go, okay, your children are not your children. They're life's extension of itself. You are the bow, they are the arrow. I mean, it's like, okay, so stop clinging, Dove. As opposed, you could simply say to me, stop clinging, but it's so beautifully poetic and deeply spiritual, and yet rock solid, like it's punch in the face reality, but with this beautiful spiritual angle.
It's inarguable, isn't it?
For me, it is, yeah. I mean, and this is why I say to people, people say, well, what is your religion? And, it's right over my shoulder in every interview I do. My religion is curiosity. And that book keeps me curious. It's always kept me curious. It's like, because I read it every year, as I said, and I read it multiple times a year. And when I read it, it's like, yep, I got something new again.
Do you have a favorite in there? I mean, I really like the children and relationships, partner.
Yeah, I like the children one. I like the marriage one, because a lot of my marriage is based on that. We are two pillars separate from each other, supporting our relationship. We talk about in our private work with couples, that there are three entities. There's you, there's me, and then there's the us, that third entity. And that third entity is held up by both of the pillars being strong. So I love that. I love the piece about friendship, but the piece that is profound for me is the piece around freedom. And I've seen you wear your freedom like golden shackles. It's like, yeah, I can remember that very clearly when I had that fierce value around freedom. And then I realized I am completely imprisoned by this idea. And that is like that's like freedom is a prison. Yeah, because it doesn't allow me to connect. It doesn't allow me to bond in the way that I was perceiving. I'm more free now than I ever was, and I have wonderful relationships. But I realized that was my spiritual bullshit that I was using to keep me out of really staying bonded to people. It's like, well, I'm just, I hold this high value of freedom. No, you nitwit. You're just avoiding connection.
Yeah, yeah. Your list is really interesting. Book number 2, it comes up in our top 10 of books that have been recommended, and with good reason. And it is Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by Richard Bach, published in 1977.
Yeah. See, you can tell by the choice of my books how old I am. Yeah. Illusions, it was this beautiful book that I remember when I first started teaching, which was 83. And in late 83, this young fella came to me and he goes, "Did you write a book under another name?" And I'm like, "No, I never even thought about writing a book." And he's like, "I read this book and it's like everything you're teaching me." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then I read the book and I was pissed. I wanted to have written the book. It's so magnificent in understanding. And for me, what I loved about it was because this was at the beginning of the time of things like Lazarus and Ramtha and all those, and a lot of spiritual woo-woo that was annoying because I couldn't ground it. It's not saying it's bad. It was annoying to me because I couldn't ground it. And when I read Illusions, it was like, this is the meat and potatoes of it all. This is what it boils down to, right? The line in the Matrix, you can't bend the spoon because there is no spoon. It's kind of like that whole thing around the pan bread and the stories in that, the way that is weaved together was actually the catalyst for my very first book, which was a novella, which was called terrible book, but it was called The Fall and Rise of Elvis Richards. But it was written in that style. And The Fall and Rise of Elvis Richards is still out there. It was self-published. I walked it around. I sold 3,000 copies by literally walking around. Covers ugly as all hell. There's tons of spelling mistakes. But it resonated with people for that same reason, that it was just this character called Magid, who is teaching the main character who is called Elvis, about life in a way that he'd never thought about it before. And for me, it was like a great awakening, that book, around my spiritual reality, which I knew about since I was a small child, but nobody had ever given me a way of saying there are other people who think like you about it. And that was wonderful for me.
Hey, maybe it's time to get that book out, get it corrected, and put it out there again.
Yeah, it maybe.
Yeah,
maybe when I'm a little more famous.
I love these, allegories, and we all get it because it's us.
Well, I wrote a piece on LinkedIn recently around stories, and I talked about how stories change our brain and why stories are so important. And we learn so much better. It's not my opinion, it's neuroscience. We learn so much better with stories than we do with facts. Yeah. And so one of the things that people don't know is because of mirror neurons and oxytocin, when you read, watch, listen to a story, whoever the main character is, you change them to you. It actually happens in your brain. You're running that movie simultaneously in your brain, and then you go into if you're reasonably a psychologically healthy individual, you go into questioning. Well, would I do that? Is that my disorder? And it makes you grow. It makes you think. And those allegories, like illusions, it's like, who am I? Where am I in this picture? Is this what I'm aspiring to? Is it giving me a vision of who I need to grow into? Is it showing me where I'm at right now and where I'm stuck and how I'm stuck and what am I clinging to? These stories are so beautifully done in that way.
Yeah. Dust it off. Get it out there again.
Thank you.
Book number 3.
Yeah.
Another book that I enjoyed greatly when I read it in the 80s.
Really?
Iron John. Yeah. A Book About Men by Robert Bly, published in 1984. I love that book.
I'm really, I cannot tell you. There's another book that's not on the list that I didn't put on the list that's about women that I loved. And every man is like, what? And I used to say to men, read the book, please, because it was about the white male system. And I said, read it. And it's written for women, but you need to read it so you understand what the white male system has done to us, how it's minimized our emotionality, our spirituality. And I found with Iron John, the women who've read it understand the spiritual connection to men in a way that other women can't. And it's just phenomenal. As I said, when I read that book, I realized that I'd learned how to be a man from a woman. I'd learned that from my mom. My mom was a single mom for a long time. And so I'd learned how to be a man from her, not because that was a misdirect. She was doing what she thought. And so a lot of what it meant to be a man was based on who I was not supposed to be. So I'm not supposed to be like my dad. So as a simple example, when I was a boy, my mom would walk down the street with me and she'd say, and people would walk with bump into her and they'd say, look at me. And they go, I know whose son you are, because I looked like my dad. Right. And my dad was very handsome, but he was a narcissist and he was an abusive husband. So I didn't take it as, oh, you're handsome like your dad. I took it as you're a philanderer, you're a dirtbag, you're a narcissist. So till I was 26 years old, I was convinced I was ugly, because it was a safety mechanism taught to me by my mom, which was, don't be like your dad. When I read Iron John, I had to understand how to sit in the ashes, as he talks about, which is a beautiful metaphor from the Vikings in the longhouses, that you would sit in the ashes of the fire if you were in grief, if you were a warrior who was wounded, and that all men are wounded warriors. And we need to sit in the ashes long enough to weep all of our tears so that we can get up and go back into the battle. I mean, it's just so many beautiful things in that book, beautiful metaphors, and finding that wild man inside of us that has had his testicles cut off and put in a jar somewhere, stealing that golden key back from our mothers, not because our mothers are evil, but because they take care of us until we claim our manhood. And then we must be wild. We must find that wild man within us. And we societally see this wild man as destructive, but no, this wild man is so destructive in the way that I talk about enlightenment. Enlightenment is an incredibly destructive force. It needs to be. It must destroy all that was in order for something new to come about. You and I, before we went on air, we're talking about politics. We're in this beautiful phase of the destructive enlightenment. It's the storm before the calm. It sucks to be in it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, oh, this is great. But it is the birth of something new. The birth of a child into the world comes through extreme pain and tearing and blood and guts and all kinds of horrible things. And then there's this magnificent creature born into the world. Iron John taught me how to do that with myself, to birth that masculine into the world in a way I'd never done before. And I'd been on the path probably more than 10 years by the time I got that book. And it still was like, oh my God, I've missed so much.
I wish, I mean, back in the 80s, there were a lot of men's groups based on his work. And, I know so many men who went to them and found them invaluable. I wish they would bring them back now.
The men's, see, this is the challenge, and I talked about this a lot, and I've written about it, is the men's movement that was under Bly and Sam Keen and Gillette and Moore and all those people was beautiful. It was magnificent. It was honoring the male.
Yeah.
And then it got hijacked by a guy called Sterling, right? And when it got hijacked, it became what was the name of that movie with Tom Cruise? He did a movie, and it was about that movement, and he was playing that character, and the theme of the thing, just excuse me, everybody, but he said, you know, praise and honor the cock. I mean, it was just horrible masculine stuff.
Yeah.
It was, you know, it wasn't about what the movement was about, and it was that really betrayed the men's movement. And I've always said it's because we were not strong enough to hold on to it. The women's movement they held on to. Men's movement we didn't hold on to it. We didn't grow it. And I ran those men's groups. And we sat around and we spoke and we cried and we held each other and we beat drums, and we went back into the world more loving, kinder men, and particularly kinder to ourselves and more compassionate to other men, instead of all this nonsense that we were doing. It was a profound book. And I'm really glad to hear that you read it. As a woman, it's so important.
Yeah, it is very important. So book number 4 is the Venta Treatise, The Eternities, by, I'm not even going to begin to try.
Pathasariji.
Say it again.
Pathasariji.
That's it. 1978.
It's okay. So he was my private teacher in Vedanta. He was my teacher for several years. I loved him very much. He was a great, wonderful teacher. And he was so not your traditional Hindu teacher. I'd studied many of the different parts of Hinduism. But when I studied Vedanta with him, it was all about, like, so you'd explain, the Atma and, this great spiritual connection and all the things that were there in every other part of Hindu teaching. But everything came down to accountability. Everything. This is your life. You created it. You're responsible. You want to make it better? You make it better. Right?
Yeah.
And I said, well, what about, and I remember having this conversation with him. And I said, what about karma? And he said, I won't do the accent because I know I'm not allowed to do that anymore. I used to do the accent. And he used to say, what does karma mean? And I said, well, it's the way that things come back to you for whatever you've done. He goes, no. The translation of karma is action. That's all it means. It's the action you take. What action will you take? Create the karma in the moment, create the action in the moment, and you will live with the ramifications of that action, whether it's the reaction you want or not. I was like, okay. Suddenly this spiritual sort of woo-woo idea became so solid and so grounded. And I remember him saying, there were so many good lessons from him that are from Vedanta, from the Venta Treatise, and where he said to me, I'd done all this New Age spiritual journey, and I'd studied Buddhism and Gnostic and Coptic Christianity and Kabbalah and all these things before I even met him. And he said to me, you have too many ideas. And I said, well, I think they're all valuable. And he said, they are. But you're trying to bring too many of them at once. And I said, okay. He said, there are 3 things you'll need on the spiritual path. And I said, okay, what are they? And he went, number 1, discernment. Now, I got to tell you, I was 24 years old, and like a standard 24-year-old, I had a reasonably large ego. That's an understatement, by the way. And I did no idea what the word discernment meant, but I was going to crack on like I did because I didn't want to be embarrassed. So I went, oh, okay. I figured I'll look it up later. He said, the second thing you'll need on the spiritual path is discernment. And I went, oh, now I'm really bollocksed. Okay. I don't know. And I thought, I hope to God the third thing isn't discernment. And he said, and the third thing is more discernment. So I was like, okay, I don't think I understand. So he begins to explain to me. And like an egomaniac talking to an incredibly wise man who is the dean of the Venta University, so clearly he knows his stuff and he can speak well, but he's got a strong Indian accent. So I figured he probably doesn't understand. So I said, "Oh, you mean judgment?" And he said, "No, no, no." And he passes me the Venta Treatise again, and he said, "No, not judgment, discernment." I said, "What's the difference?" Judgment is about them. Discernment is about you. Boom. Okay, now I understand this. My Jungian psychology, I start to now understand it, and what boundaries are. I now understand it in a very different manner. He was teaching me about boundaries. He wasn't using psychology language, but he was absolutely right. That's what it was. And there's many more beautiful lessons from that man, and he used to annoy the hell out of me because he'd give me a mantra, and then he'd say, "Come back and talk to me in 2 weeks." And I go, "I don't like this mantra." And he goes, "Come back in 2 weeks. Keep." I go, "Okay." And one of them was, I was pissed off. I went to meet him one day and I was pissed off because I just read about somebody who'd murdered his family. I was upset. And he said, "What are you upset about?" And I said, "This guy's done this. I can't imagine how you'd even do that." And he said, "Here's your mantra." I mean, like literally within 3 minutes, "Here's your mantra," and then go away. So I don't get any more time with him. And I go, "Hey, what's the mantra?" And he goes, "The murderer lives in me." Hold on. All her heckles go up. "I'm not a murderer." I get massive indignation about the whole thing. And I walk away. And of course, I am a good student. And so I walk away and the murderer lives in me. I'm just resisting it every time. And I come back a week later and I say to him, he said, "How was it with the mantra?" And I smiled at him and I said, "The murderer lives in me." And he says, "Tell me." I said, "I have murdered my own dreams and I have murdered the dreams of others. I have contemplated murder with anger. I have murdered friendships. I have murdered all kinds of things. The murderer lives in me." And he says, "Do you wish to continue to be a murderer?" That's it. Okay. Damn, you're good. So beautiful, beautiful, beautiful man, beautiful teachings, beautiful book.
Book number 5, The Family, A New Way of Creating Solid Self-Esteem by John Bradshaw, published in 1985.
Yeah, Bradshaw changed my understanding of my own family dynamic of where I'd come from. I'd already studied Jungian psychology, but I didn't understand the family dynamic. And that book is all about the family dynamic, understanding that I had created polarized parents, that my father was the demon and my mother was the angel, and that I was understanding that I was part of a constellation that I was playing into, and that my mother was not angelic and that my father was not entirely evil, and that there were parts of each of them that were valuable, but it wasn't always in the positive. They were valuable sometimes in the negative, and understanding that to discern myself away from that constellation, but that constellation had formed me in the way that I saw family. And it's interesting because when I read that book, I rewrote a treaty for myself, which was, "What is family?" And I defined family, and I now say very clearly, family to me has nothing to do with blood. It could, but it doesn't necessarily. Family for me is a spiritual connection I have with others who are supportive of me but will kick my ass, and who I am supportive of and I can kick theirs, so that we can lovingly make each other grow to the degree that if you need to leave me, I will love you so much that I can let you go. Whereas the traditional family is, "Oh, don't move away from the family." You and I know nothing about this, of course, personally. You if you leave the country, if you leave the family behind, you are somehow the betrayer. And that's the constellation of the family that Bradshaw really helped me to understand. And as I said, I read everything that he wrote after that and saw him live and spent a little bit of time with him here in Vancouver when I first moved here in 88.
Is he still around?
I can't find him if he is. Maybe you have better luck than I do, but I've not been able to find him.
Book number 6, The Dancing Woolly Masters, An Overview of the New Physics by Gary Zukav, published in 1979.
Yeah, so most people are familiar with Gary Zukav from The Seat of the Soul. This was way before that. I had read Hugh Everett III's multi-universe theory, and I'd read that, and I remember finding that book in a bookstore, and one side of the page I couldn't understand because it was all in mathematics, and the other side was about what that equation was, and that was difficult to understand. But I was completely just taken in by this theory, which is also called M theory. And so then I came in '83. I read the Dancing Woolly Masters, and I started to understand this whole idea of quantum physics. And for the first time, it made my spiritual stuff that I got and understood, but was annoyed with because it was so ungrounded, and the people talking about it were ungrounded and were kind of putting me off the thing I believed in. And it went, no, here's the science of it. And I went, what? Now remember, that's 40 years ago, and it was so profound that there's a wave and there's a particle, and they're not different things. They're the same things. Like, what? Entanglement. What? This understanding of looking at my life and my universe and everything from a very physical level, and understanding it at this quantum spiritual level, and realizing that I'm living in a quantum reality that is the way the mystics have explained spirituality forever. And it was like, you're talking about the same thing. For me, it was like, it was this deep exhale. Deep exhale. Was that like that for you?
Yes. And like you, it has to be grounded for me to be able to get into it. If you can't grasp it, if it's too ephemeral, it doesn't take root.
Right. And for me, that book, The Dancing Woolly Masters, really brought the mental, the spiritual, and the quantum together in a way that was so exciting for me. I remember walking around talking to everybody about it, and they were all like, you're a whack job. Like, they couldn't understand it. But it was like, no, this is how our lives are working. That it's not positive thinking, because that's annoying as all heck. It's not positive thinking. It's a way of being.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Well, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview, and sharing the 10 books that had the biggest influence on his life is top 30 leadership guru, best-selling author, and preeminent expert on the emotional source code, Dov Baron. We'll be back with more from Dov Baron after this break.
Times TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting Times Media's flagship radio show, What Is Going On, and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy, and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit sedgbeer.com. Click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's sedgbeer.com, sedgbeer.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those 3 levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Dov Baron, book number 7. I love this title. I think it's the perfect title for a book. Everything you know is wrong. And I could not find the author of this one because there are so many books with the same title, all looking at different aspects of life, that I just thought, okay, let's just go with this, which you say is a collection of articles.
It is. It's by Douglas Rushkoff. He's the one who was the main editor, and it came from a book that is actually it came from a mentor I had who also gave me book 10A that we may or may not get to. But it was a mentor of mine who, as I said, my whole religion is curiosity, and I've always chose mentors that will push that. And so I had a mentor who said to me, I want you to find something that you think is a conspiracy theory. And I said, okay. And he said, I want you to go research it and find the truth in it, because all conspiracy theory has truth in it. Sometimes it's just a grain, and sometimes it's a lot more than a grain, and it's been made to look like a conspiracy theory. So I began to do this research into all these different conspiracy theories. And then I found Douglas Rushkoff, who is a very established and grounded journalist who led me to people like John Pilgener, who you may or may not know. He was a British journalist. He was Australian, but he did stuff on Vietnam. He recently died, unfortunately, one of the greatest journalists to ever live. And he uncovered things. And that led me into this book, which was filled with these insane articles written by very high profile journalists. There's nothing in there from some clown who's just doing a conspiracy theory. This was stuff that was so well researched into, Henry Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, did he deserve it? Let's look at that. And should he be prosecuted for war crimes? I mean, it was just like challenging the ideas. And that's why my mentor made me, and that has remained with me sort of as a very sound piece, in that it's the part of the reason I can talk to people who are quote unquote conspiracy nuts. It's not how I see them, but they're seen that way, and say, okay, well, tell me what it is about this that really resonates with you, because there's obviously some truth in it for that person. And oftentimes you can move a person away from a very extreme way of thinking by having that level of compassion for something that is true within it. right? So there's a lot of conspiracy stuff around kids and but the truth of the matter is kids are being stolen. The kids, there is a sex slave trade that is bigger than slavery when it was at its height. This is true. Is there a basement under the pizza place where, I mean, that's, so is there truth? Yes. Is that truth played upon? Yes, to manipulate person. This book, Everything You Know Is Wrong, challenges you to look at what you're holding as truth and is it? And so for me, what it did was, and part of my own enlightenment journey was I in my deep work, in my Jungian work was, if I can't question it, it's not true. I have to question everything that's true. So I spent a long time, like before I and John, am I a man? How do I know I'm a man? Outside of my genitalia, how do I know I'm a man? Am I Jewish because that's my birth religion, or is that just what I got via the environment I was born in? Oh, well, I need to question that. Am I gay? Am I straight? Am I, all the things that seemed fundamentally obvious to me, to be willing to question them. And that book was a catalyst to doing that in the world. So, well, this is, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. Hold on a minute. Let's just have a wee look there. And maybe not. And again, it's not reclassifying, but it's understanding that the world does not exist in a binary manner, that there is this beautiful nuance. And I think it's you and I talked about this in a previous conversation. I think where we're lost is we've lost touch with nuance, context. I can say something to you today, it has a context, but take it out of context and you can cancel me tomorrow. Well, we need to get back to context. And it's just psychological and spiritual laziness that makes us do that. So in many ways, challenging and asking that question, do I know that this is true, is a way to work that muscle. That's why I love that book.
Yeah, I can see that. Book number 8, Tales of the Hasidim. And you've got the earlier masters and the later masters, and I wasn't quite sure which one yours was. Yeah. But it's by Martin Buber.
Yeah, Martin Buber, who is famous for the book called I and Thou. He was a great Hasidic philosopher. The Old Masters is my favorite. It talks about the Baal Shem Tov and many others who are the base of Kabbalah and deeply spiritual understanding of Judaism. And what I loved about that was I kind of was pissed off at Judaism. I was born Jewish and was upset and frustrated, as most people get who've been on their spiritual journey, with the religion they were born into. And this brought me back to a really deep spiritual understanding of what it really meant. And it's deeply psychological, every one of those, because it's these stories, it's these tales. And we talked about this earlier, these wonderful metaphors that made me look at what is the truth? What is the truth? And how far am I willing to journey to find that truth? Like one of the stories in there is a poor rabbi in what would today be frozen parts of Russia, living in his very poor with his wife and his 4 children in his one-room house, and they're living there, and it's freezing cold, and they've got nothing. And he gets a message, he thinks, from God, which is to go under the bridge that is the entrance to the palace where the Tsar lives, and to dig there. He'll find treasure. So he goes, and it's freezing middle of winter, and he's trying to hack away at this frozen earth. And he's always paying attention to the guards, because the guards would kill him for doing this. And he's trying to be quiet, and eventually he gets caught by one of the guards. And the guard is a generous man. Instead of killing him, he says, listen, whatever it is you believe, you're crazy. There's no gold underneath this bridge in this entrance to the palace. Go home and dig underneath your own stove. So he's very sad. He's very disappointed. He goes home and he cries to his wife that, how could he have got this so wrong, that God had guided him? And she said, well, maybe God's still guiding you. And he said, what do you mean? Well, the God said to go dig under your own stove. So he digs under his own stove and he finds treasure. And it's this metaphor of we're always looking out there for a solution. But the jewels, the gold, the treasure that we're looking for is always right under the place. And this is interesting because it's under the stove. What is a stove in that metaphor? It's a place of comfort. The comfort hides the treasure. We're always clinging to comfort. We're always looking for comfort. But you would have to do without the comfort. You have to put the stove out. You have to move it to the side. And you have to dig. You have to be in the discomfort to find the treasure. It's like, wow, so beautiful. That's just one example. Beautiful book.
Book number 9 is another one of my favorites. Getting the Love You Want, A Guide for Couples by Harville Hendrix, 2005. I think you and I seem to like similar books, and they're what I call the inarguables, you know.
Yes.
They're just so sensible.
Yeah. Yeah, I was very blessed, and my wife and I, when we first got together, we went and did training with Harville and his partner, and it was profound. In fact, we did several trainings over many years with him. And it just made me understand, like, I had a very good friend of mine who said to me, I don't understand, Dov. And I said, what? And he goes, you're one of the smartest, wisest people I know. How come you're such an idiot when it comes to relationships? Right? How come you're such a freaking idiot when it comes to relationships? And I said, I really don't know. I've really done a lot of work on that. And I'd done a lot of work on it. And it was Harville Hendrix' work that really made me get what I was doing. I was chasing my wound over and over again. And when I read that work and then I did that training, I could suddenly see that everybody I'd had a relationship was either my mother, my father, or some combination thereof. And I can remember being in a training with Harville and his partner where we were asked to hold each other, like, so the couples, right? You hold your partner and you hold them in a certain way. That's part of the training. And my wife, then my girlfriend, was holding me. And I'm bawling as she's holding me. And we sit up, and Patricia, who was leading that part of the training, said, she said, she comes around, she says to me, what was it like? And I said, it was insane. And she said, why? I said, because it was so profound, but on top of everything else, I was disgusted. And she goes, well, you didn't look disgusted. I said, no, it was incredibly heart connecting. But Ren, that's my wife, smells like an ashtray. Now, just to be clear, my wife and I have never smoked in our lives, either of us. But my mother was a chain smoker. It took me right back to being that baby, being that infant, being that toddler in the arms of my mother who smelled like a bloody ashtray. And it makes me want to vomit. And yet, so that compulsion to get close to her and the compulsion to get away from her at the same time was such a powerful insight for me. It's like, oh my God, that's exactly what I do in a relationship. I wasn't dating smokers, but I was playing out that metaphor over and over again. It was profoundly insightful for me. And once I began to see that, it became like, oh yeah, because, you know, Harville talks about it as there's 2 books, Getting the Love You Want and Keeping the Love You Find, which is for singles. But when you expand that out and you go, oh, well, what about my other relationships? And I suddenly going, oh my God, this is my friendships too. Like, am I a schmuck or what? Okay. And it really awakened me. That's why I love that book.
Yeah. Book number 10, The Presence of the Path by Damon White. I think this one was published around 2012.
The Presence of the Past, theory of morphogenetic fields and how that works was when I really got to understand resonance, because I talked about quantum fields and all the rest of it, and Sheldrake talking about these fields inside of biology and how it's the structure of cells and the structure of learning and how we're stepping into these and understanding that I took it beyond what it was in the book. I actually talked to Sheldrake about it, and he said, I never thought about that. And I talked about emotional fields. That's where the work goes with the emotional source code, is that there is emotional fields that we're stepping into. We're constantly validating something even if it's completely untrue. Or as I like to say, the mind is looking for evidence of that which it believes to be true, even if it's completely false.
Yes.
And the fields validate that. And for me, the best example of a morphogenetic field is the social media algorithm. It's a beautiful metaphor for it, because if you believe Donald Trump is the next Messiah, then everything you find online is the Messiah. If you believe that he's the biggest asshole who ever lived, then everything you find on is that, because you clicked on it. And that's how your morphogenetic field works. Whatever you're holding in resonance with yourself is pulling to you. And so I like to mess with the algorithm. So I watch CNN, I watch Fox, I watch Al Jazeera, I watch the BBC, I watch India TV, India news. So I mess with the algorithm, so it keeps sending me all these weird and wonderful things. And that's what I mean about being curious. That's what I'm trying to mess with the algorithm of my field, so that I can pull things in that I don't expect. I had a wonderful meeting yesterday with a guy who was the leader of a massive punk movement in the late 70s, early 80s, who's gone on to make world changes. And I'm like, wow, I'm so glad I met you, right? Because this is a hardcore punk guy who lived with the Clash, so serious punk, who is now influencing world change. That couldn't have happened if I just stayed in my lane. And that's why I think curiosity is so important. So understanding morphogenetic fields allowed me to see, yes, this is not the law of attraction. This is the law of resonance. The law of resonance says very simply, if you turn your radio to the pop station, you get pop. And you don't get upset when you change the station and you suddenly get classical. You go, it's a different station. Well, if you keep getting the same shit all the time that you don't like, that's because that's where you're tuned into. And it's not just, oh, well, I'll just tune into positive thinking and do more of that. No, you have to clear the things that hold you in that bandwidth. And that's the deep work. That's the courageous work. That's the work of the soul, rather than just some surface level stuff. Is digging deep into that and going, hold on a second. I can't get there by meditating and going, and I'm good. Nothing wrong with those things. Don't get me wrong, but they're not going to get you to that depth that will shift you and allow you to live the life that you came here to live. You came here to serve a purpose. And you can't do that with positive thinking. You can't do that by pretending your past doesn't count. It does. It set your resonance. And it's continuing to set your resonance until you change that resonance. And that changing that resonance is a courageous process. It takes enormous amounts of courage. It takes enormous amounts of curiosity. But when you get to that, it's real freedom. That's why I love it. But of course, I'm not passionate about it.
No, of course not.
No.
So you tried to slip in another book.
I did.
You did slip in another book. We have a choice now. We can talk a little bit about that and then expand a little bit more on the emotional source code. Or we can talk at length about your extra book that you slipped in against the rules. But I think people know by now that you are a rule breaker anyway. What would you rather do?
I'll just do a one-liner on 10A. The 10A book is The Lost Book of Enki. And again, it's like I said before, about everything you know is wrong. Yeah. It was given to me by that mentor who challenged me and he said, find something you think is complete bullshit and then read it and see if you can dig into it. And I actually got to meet Zecharia Sitchin, is the guy who wrote that book, in New York, and sat with him. And he was the leading expert in the world at reading these hieroglyphs that nobody else could understand. He was a grumpy old bugger and brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And it made me look at the world in a different way. And it changed, and just people understand, it changed my perspective on God. That's why I put that book there. It changed my perspective on God. I'm not asking anybody to follow what I'm saying here. You don't have to go with what I'm saying. But for me, up until that point, I had this idea that was difficult within me, which was that there there was a personal relationship with God that I could have, and there was this all-knowing force called God. And I never liked the idea of God being Santa Claus or an accountant with a good and a bad. It just didn't make any sense to me. Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. And so when I read that book, this idea of the Anunnaki being this other race that had come here and messed with our DNA and worked the genome from the hominids and there was a lot of, I mean, again, sounds wacky, and I thought it was wacky initially. And then, but then understanding that if I take you as the viewer, as the listener right now, if I take you and put you in a time machine and just move you back 500 years, aren't you a prophet? Aren't you? I mean, you could be dumber than a stick and you'll still be incredibly wise, incredibly profound. So if there is another alien race that came here that was so far advanced to us, they would seem like gods to us. Now, I will go, just to finish this off, I will say this. When I was a kid and I was in school, I got thrown out of science class because they were talking about the Big Bang. And I said, okay, well, where did that come from? And they said, well, it was from a bunch of gases that came together. And I go, okay, but where did the gases come from? And get out of my class. You're trying to disrupt me. And it's the same thing with the Anunnaki. It's like, well, they may have been what we have now think of as our gods. But at the same time, and by the way, there's all kinds of, it ties into mythology and all kinds of beautiful stuff like that. But at the same time, where did that come from? And if God, as this infinite intelligence, this infinite creative force in the universe, is constantly exploring itself and examining itself through its own creation, then it goes back in creation and creation and creation. So my question is, who is the God of the Anunnaki, and who is the God of that God? You know, and in biblical terms, we talk about angels and archangels, and it's that same idea, is that there's this hierarchy that we need to understand. There's something way beyond all of that. So it gave me a position of understanding that God loves me, but only as much as he loved, or she loved, or it loved Adolf Hitler. It loves me as much as it loves Mother Teresa. It doesn't differentiate between me being good or bad. I get to do that. I get to live in hell right on here on earth or not. So that's where it is for me.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll let you off of that extra one that you slipped in. We've got about three minutes left.
Sure.
Okay, you've been interviewed by numerous media outlets, CNN, you name it, just about everybody. And your models and your strategies of the emotional source code and the anatomy of meaning are used by leaders in business and governments worldwide. Tell me about the anatomy of meaning.
The anatomy of meaning is being able to understand why you, me, we, or nations give something meaning. So the baseline is our emotional source code. And think of that as your emotional DNA. It's just what you got, right? At the same time, we can know that identical twins can have exactly the same DNA, yet they become very different people because that DNA gets switched on and switched off. Your emotional DNA is exactly the same. And what happens is your environment, which is the epigenetic environment that you live in, determines meaning. And so you look at, i.e., good-looking means misogynistic, means narcissistic, etc. So that's the anatomy of meaning I gave good-looking. It's not the truth. It's the meaning I gave it. We do this at a political level. We do this at a race level. And because at a base level, we are tribal. In primitive psychology, we are tribal. And this wonderful neurotransmitter called oxytocin is the bonding hormone. But it is also the separation hormone. It's the othering hormone. So if there's a wonderful movie that just came out recently, won an Oscar, about a German soldier who works at Auschwitz, who has a home outside of it, and he has a family, and he's a loving father and a loving husband, and then he has to go into the camp and do his job. Yeah. And you go, well, how can you do that? Are you psychopathic? No, that's oxytocin. That's how it works. It can allow us to very deeply bond with somebody, and at the same time, very clearly other. And so our job as spiritual warriors is to humanize the other. We must constantly humanize the other, humanize the Donald Trump, humanize the ISIS, humanize the whoever it might be. And so when we're doing that, then we start to challenge that emotional source code, anatomy of meaning. Once we change that anatomy of meaning, it's very difficult to hold on to a rigid identity.
There's an awful lot of dehumanization going on in the world right now.
Exactly. And that's one of the great challenges we face. So
Yeah.
when I went to Iran in 2016, I came back and wrote 12 misconceptions about Iran. I wrote an article that was on entrepreneur.com and a bunch of other places and went pretty viral. And just because I wanted people, because I was like, this is the problem. You've got somebody like John Bolton who wants to go and bomb Iran. But let me just tell you about Iranians. And I was like, you know, you think they all ride around on camels and it's hot. It's February, it's snowing, and my hotel backs onto a ski hill. That doesn't sound much like what you think, right? No. So, and by the way, you think people are in camels? Well, they're in shitty old Toyotas, and they're in Mercedes, and they're in Lamborghinis, and they're in all those things, and they're driving their kids to work, and they're driving to work, and they're to school, and they're driving to work, and they're living normal lives just like you and me.
Yeah.
These are human beings, and we need to remember that.
You know, on that note, I'm going to have to leave it, Dov, because we are almost out of time. But yes, absolutely. We're all human beings, and we all need to remember that.
Thank you so much for having me on, Sandy. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Well, thank you for adding your 10 best list of spiritual books to the archive. It's very much appreciated. Okay, you can learn more about Dov Baron's life-changing courses, books, and services at his website, Dov Baron, DOVBARON.com. Do check it out. You'll find some very, very interesting things there. That's it for this week. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me. And thanks again, Dov Baron.
Thank you.